Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the three distinguished panelists to this session of the Global Investigative Journalism Conference 2021 on Pandora Papers and Financial Crime. My name is Kunda Dixit, and I'm a journalist based in Kathmandu. And I was the past chair of the Center for Investigative Journalism here in Nepal. Even though it's frightfully early in some parts of the world, it is fantastic to see so many of you taking part in this virtual session. And despite stiff competition from COP26 in Glasgow, which is happening simultaneously, this overwhelming interest, I think, is proof of not just the importance of what this global investigation uncovered and continues to uncover, but also the methodology with which it was done. And we are going to hear from our panelists about how they accomplished this enormous task. To those of you who may not have heard of this largest ever investigative project, let me briefly summarize it. The Pandora Papers is the biggest series of exposés by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and the Organized Crime Corruption Reporting Project, as well as media outlets in 117 countries. This is not just the first leak of secret financial data. There have been the Panama Papers, there's been the Paradise Papers, and various others. Journalists have analyzed nearly 12 million leaked documents from tax havens with strict financial secrecy laws, which actually allowed public figures to stash their ill-gotten wealth. The papers have exposed secret holdings, shell companies, trusts of hundreds of politicians, including serving presidents, prime ministers, and even kings in 90 countries. In fact, 35 of those named are incumbent or former national leaders. As we will soon hear, the confidential documents show how politicians, government officials, oligarchs used these shell companies and trusts to move their dirty money around the world with the intention of laundering it to buy real estate, villas, yachts, executive jets, and all kinds of luxury items. But we must also acknowledge that, like in past exposés, few of those implicated have actually been prosecuted within their jurisdictions. There are many reasons for this. Some of those named have already carried out state capture, so that law enforcement and the courts are under their control anyway. There's a lack of rule of law in many countries. This is also helpful in deterring prosecution. And many have used financial loopholes like registering trusts to get around those laws in their countries. In some places, those named in the papers were powerful enough to squelch or downplay media coverage of the Pandora Papers. Like in previous leaks, this project has spotlighted murky dealings in tax havens and abuse of corporate secrecy. This has provided tax authorities in some countries the evidence necessary to go after evaders and launderers. In India, for example, several personalities named in previous leaks are in jail, and the authorities have managed to retrieve billions in unpaid taxes. But we live in an age when democracy and press freedom are threatened not just by totalitarian states, but by elected leaders in supposedly open societies. Journalists involved in reporting the Pandora Papers, for example, have been hounded in some of these countries. Money laundering, financial crime, smuggling, and trafficking all thrive in countries with poor governance, weak law enforcement, and a tainted judiciary. My own country, Nepal, is emerging as an example. Nepal's richest man, who's also a member of parliament, and other top tycoons were named in the Pandora Papers. It doesn't look like anything will happen to them. Ultimately, this kind of playing hide and seek with money through shell companies widens the gap between rich and poor, both globally and within our countries. And with that, let me dive right in and introduce our panelists today in the order that they will be presenting. First, we have Scilla Alecci of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which was one of the groups involved in bringing out the Pandora Papers. She'll be followed by Purity Mukami, who's a data and investigative journalist with the Finance Uncovered based in Kenya. And last but not least, we will hear from Miranda Petrucic from the Organized Crime and Financial Reporting Project, where she's deputy editor looking at Central Asia. The speakers will present for 15 minutes each, and we will have about 25 minutes at the end for discussions. You can post your questions on the Q&A box, and I'll try to pose them to the panelists for quick responses and have them translated if necessary. And with that, let's begin with Scilla, Alecci.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen now. I hope you can see it. Oh, sorry. No, sorry. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm a reporter and coordinator for Asia and Western Europe with ICIJ. ICIJ, I'm not gonna speak much about the project because Kunda has kindly introduced that already. But I wanted to give you an overview that will be helpful for what I'm going to talk to you about today. So ICIJ obtained the leaked information about 2 years ago. And we are a nonprofit news organization based in Washington. And the leak at the beginning was based on a few million documents. And as the time went by, we managed to get about 12 million documents. As we saw that these documents included leads from so many different countries, we started to approach partners in more than 100 countries around the world. And in the end, the final team was about 600, comprised of about 600 reporters from more than 150 media partners. And Purity and Miranda are two of our partners, and they will talk to you about their experience with Pandora Papers. As you know, ICIJ has been working on the offshore industry for a while, about 10 years actually, and the most popular project was Panama Papers. And so we've built some expertise in managing large data and also in understanding the system. The peculiarity of Pandora Papers consists in the fact that this time the leak was coming from 14 different offshore providers, while in the past, the leak, for example, Panama Papers and others, were based on information only from one company. So this means that we were really able this time to see how the whole system works in its complexities, and not just how one company operates. We also found the largest number of beneficial owners, which are the true owners of shell companies and trusts. As Kunda said, we also found the highest number of politicians ever in a leak, which was actually the first, let's say, surprising finding that ICIJ reporters like me uncovered in the first months of the investigation. Which is the very high number of elected officials and the politicians who continue to use shell companies and trusts to hide money, which doesn't always imply illegality, but surely prevents the public and voters from scrutiny and from understanding what these politicians, these politicians' actions are. So I wanted to talk to you today about the trends that we have seen as we were looking into this data, so that also even people who don't have experience working with offshore accounts, as well as people who have experience, can learn something. I want to share these lessons with you. So the first trends that we saw were that after Panama Papers and other leaks basically exposed the offshore industry and the implications for the world and for countries' economies, some tax havens cracked down on the sector or started to reform it. For example, the BVI introduced a beneficial ownership registry, which is still not available to the public, but required agents to disclose the identity of owners to the authorities. And the Bahamas, for example, cracked down on some bad actors. At the same time, we see that other jurisdictions emerge because they used that as a business opportunity to attract those people who had fled jurisdictions who had become more transparent. And so among those jurisdictions, there is the UAE and, surprisingly, the USA. The USA is one of the biggest tax havens now. And as you know, every state is different, but surely we, as you can see in this graph, South Dakota, Florida, and Delaware were most represented in the data as countries that offer secrecy and protection to people who want to hide their money. So just to give you a spoiler alert, ICIJ will start adding data from the Pandora Papers to our offshore leaks public database starting from the beginning of the year, and that will happen, will take place in various phases. But so that will help everyone who is interested in looking into shell companies and whatnot to track those names found in Pandora Papers. Another trend that we saw was the use of trusts. Trusts, for those who are not familiar with this term, are legal arrangements. They're not companies. They're a bit. It's a hybrid. It's a hybrid definition, but these are legal arrangements that allow the owner of an asset to distance themselves from those assets by basically giving those assets to a third party. In this case, a trustee, which can be a person or a company. And this trustee will hold those assets on behalf of the person. What does this mean? It means that they can be used to hide ownership and to add another layer of ownership and secrecy to already complex offshore structures. So you can see here, for example, this is an example from the Sri Lankan politician and her husband who tied to the ruling family of the Rajapaksas, who own trusts in Cook Islands and Samoa. The trusts usually own companies or assets like cash, artworks. They can own anything. They also use loans to transfer money from trusts to their companies. And if you ever come across trusts in your future investigations, you may want to be aware of those elements. And you will also want to be aware of the fact that they can be as simple as this or as complicated as this. Things can get very complex once you start using offshore entities. So I've shared with you a tip sheet, but I've summarized some of the things that you may want to look into when, if you come across trusts. You want to understand the jurisdictions where they are registered, and Tax Justice Network has great country dossiers on their website. Sometimes those dossiers have the name of the experts who wrote it, so you can also contact them and talk to people. You want to understand the type of trusts because there are many different kinds, and I'm going to go into detail now. And you also want to know what questions to ask. And I have listed here a few. You want to know who the actual owner is and how the money flows and whether these loans are legitimate loans or they are used just to avoid booking income, avoid taxes, and manage money in a way that is not proper. Another things that we at ICIJ have decided to investigate is the system. So obviously, it is very important to look into isolated cases and see how these corrupt people use their shell companies and trusts to hide money, etc. But since we've been looking at this for quite some time, you know, we have, as Kunda also said, we we know now that the offshore industry and its secrecy allows money to be hidden and in a way enables inequity around the world. And what we wanted to do in this case was to understand who is helping this system to thrive, who are the enablers of the system. And so we, thanks to the complexity of this leak made of documents from 14 different providers, we were really able to understand how the supply chain works and all the cogs in this wheel. And here you will see in the graph that it all starts with the clients, but the clients don't go directly to offshore service providers to open a shell company. If I'm rich, I'm wealthy, or if I'm a criminal, I don't go directly to an offshore provider in the BVI. There are going to be many steps that allow me to do that. So the first step will be an introducer. You will have an international financial advisor or a lawyer or a bank, someone who introduces me to that provider. And in that, already you can find news stories by looking at whether these introducers, these intermediaries are regulated in your country. And if they are not, why they are not. For example, we have found in the US and Switzerland, the lawyers and other kinds of financial intermediaries that are not banks are not regulated and they don't have the same due diligence requirements, thanks to powerful lobbying and other tricks that they have allowed the industry to escape scrutiny in a sense. So that also can be a story and can allow also people from countries where they don't have enough data to look at the enablers, maybe in other countries, in Western capitals, for example, or in Hong Kong or other more regulated capitals. Also, you may want to look at the banks that are used whenever you see offshore accounts. Sometimes, even if they are major banks, they may use offshore branches and units. And you may want to see if those have ever been fined or there's ever been a violation in any of these countries. And because a lot of institutions, again, are based in a lot of Western capital and regulated markets, you may be able to find more information like that, even if you are in a country where data is not so much available. And finally, it is when we talk about enablers, we also want to look at the end of the transaction. After the client sets up a shell company or a trust, they're going to use that for some reason. They're going to use it either for real estate, which is something very common, or to invest in stock, or to buy property, whatever. You want to look at who is helping them doing that. And are they regulated? And if they are not, why? Or is there any accountant that has helped them? Any accounting firm, a big four? All of these entities are responsible in a way for this system. And we believe it's worth investigating those, as well as or at the same time as you are investigating the corrupt person or the billionaire, etc., who is hiding the money. And as one of the provider told us when we sent the comment request, he said, "We are not the almighty and may miss points occasionally." So you want to look at those points. Are they missing them because of negligence, because of a mistake, or because there is an intention to miss those points? Why are they not why are they not conducting due diligence? And this applies to providers as well as any other intermediaries, lawyers and bankers. These are all part of the system. The system is not just made of offshore providers and clients. These are the stories that we produced. This is just ICIJ stories that we produced based on that. And I also wanted to let you know that this may be also one of the ways to get more impact, because there will always be a person who is corrupt in the world, always. But there is opportunity for change and impact if you look at the system and if you look at the industry and what's needed to regulate it and to make it better also for the others. Finally, I wanted to talk about one case study and to show how we collaborated with other journalists, with other partners, and how we used leaked records and others normal reporting, traditional reporting. So the Czech Prime Minister, Andrej Babiš, was one of the first names we identified a few months, basically almost before the pandemic or around the time the pandemic started. And that's when obviously we decided to call our Czech partners because they had to look into this, and it was important for them to cover this story. And the team in the end, again, it became bigger and bigger. It was also made of French reporters, British reporters, German, and so forth. So the leaked records initially gave us the money flow and the offshore scheme, basically how Babiš had managed to transfer 15 million euros or $22 million through offshore to buy property in France. And we started building timelines and also drawing connections between the entities and starting to identify the sources we had to talk to. And then obviously from this offshore scheme, we needed to go onshore. If the properties were in France, we needed to go to France to understand first if the documents were accurate and whether these properties still existed. And so our French reporters did apply for documents at the land registry office, and we got information about those properties in France. They also gave us more details about the timeline of the acquisition and so forth. They also showed us that it was not known, because it was known that the Prime Minister had a restaurant in the town, but these properties that we had found were different, were in a separate part of the town. Our Czech reporters then also went and applied for, did a FOIA request, asking for documents on the asset declaration of the Prime Minister, because the second step was to understand whether he had declared those properties. And after months, we found out that the request came back and we found out that he had not declared those assets. We then looked at whether the law had changed since he had bought the property until now, and it had changed really slightly. So at the time, he was still responsible for declaring those assets, and he had not done that. And then finally, we also used financial statements. Also, these are in the public records that mentioned one of the companies that we had found in offshore documents, in the leaked documents. These public financial statements gave us another hint, which is that there was a company that we did not know about before, that was not in the leaked data, that provided more information on Babiš property and the acquisition activities. So we went back to France to request the final documents on that additional company, and voila, we found that he owned more properties in France. So this is, and again, I've shared this with you, but this is to show you how we collaborated in a team, and we used leaked records and more traditional reporting to uncover this story that led to, as you know, as some polls say, to 8% of former supporters deciding not to vote for Babiš at the last elections. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we go to Purity, I just wanted to say thank you to Scilla, and sorry for cutting you off when it was getting really exciting with all the cross-border reporting. I couldn't help noticing that the organogram that you had for the tax haven networks, it looked like the coronavirus, with the enablers being the spike proteins. And I thought that was very symbolic. Let's move right on to Purity, and who's from Finance Uncovered in Nairobi, which has exposed the dealings of prominent Kenyan and Nigerian figures in overseas property. Please go ahead, Purity.
Thanks, Kunda. So I'm gonna share my screen. So there we go. So yeah, my name is Purity. Again, I'm based in Nairobi. I have a little bit of mathematical background, and lots of my world happens in rows and columns, but I meant this presentation as basic, like for beginners. I was thinking of young journalists like me who may not have participated in a huge leak like this before. So for the experienced one, forgive me if I am too basic. So I will concentrate on how we used a bit of data skills, because as you've heard from Scilla, the leak was one source of data, but there were all these other data sets in different countries that you could use now to understand what these offshore entities were used for. So at Finance Uncovered, and in collaboration with journalists in UK, Kenya, and Nigeria, when we got invited to this project around December, this is how we went around, because here is 12 million documents. And when you just search Kenya alone, you're getting over 20,000 documents. So where do you begin? And you don't have like 3 years to investigate. So I'm going to share with you a few steps that we took that helped us find various stories and how we zeroed in on what to proceed with. So we first of all created a list, like spent 3 weeks figuring out who may be in that leak from Kenya. So most of the time I will refer to the Kenya story, but you use the same steps for to support the Nigeria story. So we created a list of various Kenyans. These include politicians, wealthy people, cabinet secretaries, and we created a list of over 4,000 names. And then we conducted like batch searches, where you're not just searching one person at a time. So those lists helped us like choose, okay, let's see cabinet secretaries, okay, let's see MPs or that way, so that we are able to find who is in the leak in a faster manner. But the problem is you will now find more than one person, and how do you decide who to focus on? So some of the times you explore the documents that you find. Sometimes the names are not exact, but there are ways to make your searches smarter. So you explore the documents that we explored the documents for specific people that we found. Most of the time beginning with people who had more documents, like 50 documents, hundreds of documents. But this will just give you an indication of who is in there, because sometimes maybe it's just one document that names the person, but then the activity now proceeds from the companies that they created. Now, this is where things may start getting really overwhelming, because you now have to figure out which entities does this person have, and what did these entities do, what were they used for. So at this stage also you want to spend time understanding what form of documents are you getting. So for me, it was a first quite a bit of a beginner in the financial system, offshore financial systems. I spent a lot of time researching about what a certificate of incumbency implies. Who are these service providers in the first place? What's their history? What are all these offshore structures used for? What are the laws around putting up such structures? What are the disadvantages? And really understanding the ecosystem. And then once you zero in on the personalities you want to concentrate on, then we identified the companies linked to those people. Like for the Kenyatta family, you will see we came up with more than 10 companies. And then we want to understand what were these companies for. So it means reviewing different documents for each of these companies. And then this is when we begin creating a master list. So this is where Google Sheets and Excel sheets or whatever tools you like using to organize your findings come in handy, because you will get really confused when you're trying to think, which company was I looking at and which company does this document belong to? So we spent a lot of months on now going through those documents and trying to understand the activities of these entities. And Scilla talked about timelines and shown you a number of diagrams. So you want to start creating a timeline as you research, because you will keep referring to where you stopped yesterday, and you will keep being confused, and they will keep being, and at the end of the whole process, your editors will ask you, where did you find this? Can you show me the link? When did you find? Like, you need to really be organized with your research as you proceed with the project. So we created timelines for both for our project, and then we kept them really detailed. And then it's from these diagrams and timelines, and I could share them because they included things we didn't publish. So that's why I'm not going to share our timelines and diagrams. But then it's from these timelines that you're able to explain to your editors, to your graphics designers, to your video editors, without driving them crazy with the amount of information you have. And then that's when now you're able to storyboard, to talk to experts, to script, and these timelines will really help you when you're fact checking to find your links very fast. I put this slide here, and I didn't put so much content about it, but this was possible because of a lot of collaboration of close to 20 people, at least for the stories we worked on. This is because it's not everybody who has the Excel skill set. I am good with Excel, with R, but some of the data required SQL or some other advanced database manipulation, and you don't have to know everything. So we always knew we have someone to ask for help with something. So collaboration was really a big deal in this project. So as I said, this is just to give you an example of how our list looked like for Kenya. So we had like close to 4,200 names for Kenya. They included wives, children, brothers and relatives of various people. And then when you get the preliminary findings from these batch searches, because remember, we are dealing with 12 million documents and you don't know where your person is. So as you go through the documents, that's when you start landing on gems, little by little. Like in our case, the exciting moment was when we are going through Miranda International documents. And these were like hundreds, like 300 of them. So you begin maybe by PDFs or Word documents or Excel sheets. And because this company was using nominee directors to sign for their different transactions, that's why we happened to find a property document in the link because they had sent some tax filing documents to their nominee directors in BVI to sign the tax return document. And that's when we saw, that's when I began to understand how these offshore entities are being used by a UK company and why nominee directors are useful. But then we wondered, how do we know whether there are other properties that this company could be owning in UK. And in UK, they have this overseas companies that own property in England and Wales data set that is released every month. It's in millions of rows and a number of columns. And we were going there just to find if we will find Miranda International on another property. And then it dawned on us, these are, this is massive. But this, the UK government only gives the name of the company. Then we thought, how can we search these offshore companies in the leak? And of course, it was not very easy because these were in millions of companies. So this is where your data skills come in. And when I say data skills, I don't mean like magic. It's like little Excel formulas that will help you to cross-check between different data sets. And remember the master list I talked about, you're creating the companies you're finding in the leak. Now you're able to search them in this database in a more automated way rather than like control find one company. So little Excel formulas like VLOOKUP, which you can just learn even on YouTube. But now cross-matching whatever is in the leak with whatever is in public in your own countries and other countries is where you start getting more value. So here the challenge was this list are released monthly by the UK government since 2014. I personally didn't have the know-how of how to combine these different lists so that I have one big search. So this is where collaboration with BBC and Guardian data teams really came through because they were good with SQL and they could pick things for us faster. And that's basically what I'm explaining. When you have one source of data from the leak, then you have massive data sets out here that are more public that can help you understand what these structures are used for. I've already talked about the tools we used. And one of the misconceptions people thought is that we had like all the documents, including the banking documents. No, for some of the cases, you just have one single document with a name and a company. And then it's up to all these other data sets that are available outside of the leak that you now start to understand the use of these entities and the legalities of that behavior. So I did not say too much about whatever Excel formulas we used, whatever SQL, because I noticed in this conference, there are sessions for spreadsheets and SQL. And so I encourage all of you to attend those ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Purity, for really illuminating to us the intricacies of navigating these mountains of data and how to make sense of it. I think these are very practical tips, but also I think they're a really good reminder to us that in a story like this, stories like this, cross-border investigation, collaborating with people outside is really, really important. Let's go right on to the next speaker. Miranda, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Kunja. And thank you so much to my colleagues, Scilla and Purity. And I have to say that very often, people think when you get a leak, it solves all your problems. And I think, their session and hopefully some of the slides that I just shared will show how much work it really goes into producing these stories and what a masterful investigative reporting they are. Because, the leak is your beginning, but the end comes with so many skills, so many knowledge, and so many years of learning to become a great investigative reporter, to be able to do this. Scilla was very good about explaining the enablers. I would sometimes call them almost like a criminal service industry, because while they are legitimate businesses, they are basically servicing criminals or corrupt officials, and they are aware that what their client is doing is probably unethical, illegal. And I think what is fascinating about seeing these leaks is that, and working with these leaks, is that you actually see how many people and different organizations do service certain clients. And you can also see how much they have at their disposal. They have law firms, they have obviously company registration services. I mean, so many real estate firms, PR firms, even business intelligence firms that are basically, paid by the people we're investigating to either, establish secretive companies or to squash competition or to stop reporters from reporting about them. One thing that, and then you put yourself as a small reporter. I'm based in Bosnia. Petrucic comes from Kenya. Many of you come from, India, Nepal, Pakistan, many of the places where, we don't have the resources and the same amount of money to basically report about these people, yet we are able to, uncover the ways that these people have, used their ill-gotten gains. And part of it is really, we just need one piece of information to basically begin this whole process of piercing through their secrecy. And, obviously, I love getting phone calls from ICIJ when they say, oh, we have a new leak. I get tremendously excited because I know there is going to be some really good stories coming out of there. And, very often that's our first steps. We find the name. And then, of course, you have to scroll through this all other steps in reporting. But really, that's your beginning of piercing through the secrecy. As you have heard, there are a lot of investigative techniques that go into this. And I will say that one thing that has always worked for me is that I would try to put myself in the shoes of criminals or the people I'm investigating and think like them. Because if you can think about the ways that they would hide their money, very often it gives you an idea where to look for it. And of course, collaboration is the key. I think what's really amazing about being here again at GIJC conference, it's so amazing to see all of you and basically to, talk to the old friends and basically, think about the future and the new stories we can be doing in the cooperative environment. And also, investigations like, Pandora Papers and many others that ICIJ has done, and also many others have been part, with OCCRP, would not be possible if it wasn't for skills for so many people and knowledge and sources and, abilities to do this kind of investigations. I think for me, one story that was very close to me and, was shocking and surprising in Pandora Papers was obviously the Alia family in Azerbaijan. The leak itself was, I don't know how many other people have used the offshore providers as much as the Alia family. I think we found almost 90 companies that belong to them and 2 of their associates. Now, it sounds like, oh my God, this is a wealth, and it was, but it also was a tremendous effort to just understand, even to understand what these documents say, and then of course, what on earth would somebody do with 90 companies? Something we have discovered, obviously it was a collaboration with a lot of amazing reporters, was that, they acquired over or nearly $700 million worth of properties in London. And, should I say I was surprised? Probably not. But it was amazing to be able to see how the offshore secrecy has been used, and how in many cases, one of the findings was that a son of Ilham Aliyev was only 11 when he became, a owner of, a huge building in London. And that comes as a surprise. I also want to say that, in our journalistic work, when you say about working with, leaks, and when we say about investigating financial crimes, very often what comes to play are, stories we have worked on before, For example, Alia family has been somebody I have been working on for many years, including with reporters from Azerbaijan. Obviously, we have looked into, Azerbaijani laundromat and other laundromats, and we have found many traces of Azeris in there. And it was, of course, I should say, not a surprise that, some of the laundromat data came to be usefully also in, Pandora Papers, because we've seen that some of the properties or some of the companies that have bought properties in London have actually received money through the laundromats just before the purchase. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that really, our reporting, and when we talk about uncovering these really difficult, complicated stories, very often we need to rely on the previous reporting we have done. And I think, for me as a reporter, before, when I was very young, I never thought of, oh, I should save all my previous documents, because you think, oh, I'm done with the story, let's delete it. And actually, now that I have a very good archive of all my previous reporting, it's really amazing to see how sometimes things that I didn't even think would be important in the years to come suddenly become very important for the new stories we are working on. So what really, with every of these stories, whether it was this Alia story or any other story involving financial crime, I think, for us as journalists, what is really important is to, first understand what is happening, understand the crime, that is taking place, and then understand, where we can get information, figure out how the system, how did they do it, and then of course follow the money, because that's what is going to show us, where did they spend the money that they have obtained through the, financial crimes. When I mentioned, understand how the crime works, and this is something that as a journalist, we are lucky that we are given opportunity to learn every single day. This is what our job is. We can learn. And for us to do this job, I think, we need to understand how money laundering works. What, Scilla was saying that, over the years, as they were working through all these investigations, they were learning how the enablers work. They were learning that, clients don't go directly through registration agents. They do need, somebody to, introducer, intermediary, and so on. And for us as journalists, understanding, how does, fraud works, how money laundering works, how the offshores are used to, commit a tax fraud or hide the ownership ownership of a property and so on. It's incredibly important. And, understanding, and this is something that it's really good, we were mentioning here, Perti was saying that, when she just started, she didn't know what these documents are showing. And I think that for many of us, this is the feeling that we have. But the good news is, once we learn about these crimes, if I see, loan agreements, or if I see contracts for the sale of goods that are not really taking place, or that they're fake contracts, I can say, well, yeah, this seems to be trade-based laundering. And I can be saying, well, okay, this is how I report this particular, crime. And so it's really, really important as a journalist that we learn and educate ourselves about, how some of these crimes work. I will say that, a lot, and you can have seen that, in even Scilla's presentation, she was talking about, public records, obtaining the asset declaration, getting the land records. And, for us as journalists, again, leak is the beginning. There's so much more reporting that needs to go into, until we get the story. And, very often, we get questions, I remember, whenever we do this big leak, everybody wants to do an interview, and then all they care is like, tell us the names from Bosnia. And, I keep thinking, well, it doesn't matter who shows up in the leak, right? It's the fact that somebody is in data, it's not a crime. It's what they do with this company. And that's the really difficult part of uncovering. We could all be in the business of, here's the 20,000 names from this country. But that's not what the story is. The story is really, can we figure out what the crime somebody committed? And, journalistically, I work in parts of the world that are very scarce when it comes to public records. In Azerbaijan, you cannot find out who owns local companies. You cannot find out who owns a certain property. These records are not available. But at the same time, as a journalist, one thing I have learned early on in my career is that, if I can tell, what's in my country, does not mean it is the same situation around the world. And very often when I'm investigating the people I'm investigating, their footprint goes outside the borders of the home country. And very often you will find, many pieces of puzzle that will help you tell the story by looking at the records outside. So one thing I think it's really, really important for journalists to understand all kinds of public records, and to understand that, these public records, even if they don't exist in their countries, and, we are now at the global conference, and I know there are many countries in the world where many of these records are not available, they do exist outside their borders. And very often, the people who are rich and powerful, they will go outside these borders. And, when we talked about the Alia family, while I cannot find out any of the properties that they own in London, in Azerbaijan, because of the, London property records being available, we were able to uncover all these properties that they have there. Another thing I would like to mention is about the companies. And, when if you guys remember my first slide, when I talk about all these enablers that are available to the corrupt people, I will also say that, in the recent years, journalists have, we have now available many of the tools that really can help us track down these people, even sitting from our own homes. I don't know, I know many of you don't, and I have put together I apologize, I have put together a tip list where I have mentioned some of these databases and the links to these databases. But for me, as a journalist, I think, and at OCCRP, we're very lucky to have access to these. We use a lot of databases to basically look for people and companies when we're investigating them. And I will mention just a few of them. We have access to something which is called Factiva and LexisNexis. And what is really beautiful about these databases is that when you search something, on a Google, much of what was reported around the world is not available, as in terms of articles. Many articles are behind a paywall. Many publications are not necessarily online anymore. Many of them have been closed down, especially like in some countries where, the freedom of the media has been suffering, and, many of the news organizations have stopped existing. So for me, for example, when I'm reporting in Azerbaijan, or I'm reporting in, Central Asia, I will very often go and search for articles that were published in, in media before, and they are captured still in things like Factiva or in LexisNexis. So that's one of my advices, try to get the access to these databases, and very often they're available through the libraries in your countries. I also really love Orbis, which I think is a fantastic database. It basically allows you to see if a company has any subsidiaries. And, very often, even if you have an offshore company, if that company has a subsidiary, let's say in Montenegro, one of the countries that I used to report in, for example, in the business registry there, you would find information about the BVI company. So, and in general, seeing the geographical footprint of a business or of a person is really important. Obviously, ICIJ has a fantastic offshore leaks database. Scilla said, keep an eye on it. They will be adding more names. OCCRP has built a database we called Aleph. Basically, we have added, millions of records. Well, millions, many hundreds of millions of records there, and many of the leaks that we found on the internet, including, and also obviously some of the databases that we have scraped in the past, looking, knowing about, where to get information about companies in some of the obvious jurisdictions like UK, France, places where people like to establish businesses, but also on properties. That would be, if you're investigating financial crime, this is what you should be looking for. And obviously, court records, they're incredibly important. I will give you one more advice. As somebody who's reporting on the financial crimes, I think, understanding how to read financial statements is really important for journalists. And I know most of us don't like math, and many of us think, oh my God, this is so scary. There is no chance on earth I could ever do it. And, what I'll say is don't try to do it as accountant. But what you should think about it is when you look at the financial statement, what story does it tell me? And these financial statements, they're available in many parts of the world. They're easy to get, and they give you a wealth of knowledge and information, even in your own, countries. Because, for example, if a UK company owns a business in, let's say, Uzbekistan, there would be information in the UK financial statements about the activities of the Uzbek business. So I would definitely, that would be one of my advices, really get familiar and, go beyond the fear of, that being about the math. Because for me, I love to ask myself questions when I, look at the financial statements. If I look at the balance sheet, my question is, can I figure out what this company owns? And, how much money did the shareholder put in? And does it have any debt? I mean, those are the questions I ask myself. And you see, then it goes beyond the scary numbers in this, heavy financial documents. It basically comes down to questions that I can find answers to. I also want to talk about, and, Pretty has mentioned a little bit about it. It's so important to be very organized about when you do this, this kind of work. For me, every story I do something which is called the critical information. I think, what are the things I need to prove in my story? I think about, I start putting together, timelines, summaries, lists. I'm going to show you just briefly, this was the spreadsheets, a timeline that I've done for the Alia story. You can see I had all my companies, and I had it nicely distributed across various columns, which mentioned things, and it was easy to filter and search through. And it was incredibly useful because I could see 90 companies all in a chronological order as the things were happening, and I could see, and this was, for example, I keep track of every company I come across, every name I come across, because that helps me. As a journalist, you very often basically start a story and you don't know who all the people are, and it's easy to forget the name because it just doesn't mean anything to you. But when you have it saved somewhere, it's really useful. And then my last tip, and I don't always listen to it myself, but it's so important to write these stories very early. They are very complex. I know, when I need to write, I go through the massive panic attack thinking, oh my God, how do we even, what is my story? I have so many stories I could tell from this. So that would be one advice, try to think about innovative ways to tell stories, like we did here with this, we did interactive map, but also, delete and cut until the story is ready. Thank you so much. And I apologize if I went over time.
Thank you, Miranda. That's great. I think most important takeaway from this is that the leak is just the beginning, and it takes a lot of painstaking detective work, and you have to think like a criminal. How will a criminal operate, and then get into their skin? And essentially, basically, you need to follow the money and learn maths. That seems to be the main tips that Miranda has given. There's a question right away for Miranda, which I'll go into because we're now beginning the discussion session. Does OCCRP have online modules that we can use for training? Otherwise, how do you learn how money laundering works?
So we have, so I don't know if they are, I know we have been developing our own training platform for some of the reporters we have been training in some parts of the world. I don't know if it's available online, but I can check. And if somebody wants to send me a message to miranda@occrp.org, I can get back to them. Other way to learn is really, there's so many amazing trainings that, so many conferences. I think, being at a conference like this is amazing. GIJN has amazing tool sets with all kinds of, like materials to learn. In other cases, I think, talk to people, if you need help figure something out, you can reach out, obviously, to me or another reporters who can tell you how they report it, and also read about it. I mean, there's like, there's a fantastic podcast that you can listen to about, money laundering and financial crimes. So there's a lot you can find on the internet if you start. And obviously it will take experience, and, hopefully you'll have a good editor who might, who knows about this and can help you, guide you through this kind of reporting.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes, so we can take some more questions, but there is one for Scilla, which is that although the Pandora Papers mentions names and countries and people who are involved, are there any omissions that really are glaring, like countries which should be mentioned but they aren't? I mean, why are their names missing? This is a question for Scilla.
Yeah, so first of all, I would like to remind everybody that when you get a leak, you don't select what kind of information you get. So this is and also this is just a portion of what's out there. We talk about 12 million of records, and in the past we have 11 and 14. This is just a little tip of the iceberg. So the fact that we didn't have some names from some countries in this league doesn't mean that they are not somewhere, but we don't know what we don't know. A lot of people always have conspiracy theories about why the Americans are not in these leagues. Well, in this case, one answer is that they have their own tax havens. They don't need to go to BVI when they can go to Delaware and drive 5 hours, That's one answer. And the other thing is that, again, we got information from 14 providers before we had Mossack Fonseca, Appleby, etc. And there are so many out there that could be used, and so many jurisdictions. So yeah, it's a very simple answer, but this is what it is. And obviously we would love to have, the president of, I don't know, the USA in the documents, but if he wasn't there, he wasn't. That's it. We cannot do much about it.
Yeah, there's a follow-up question to that, which is, suppose there were no leaks, where would you even start?
But where would you start to do what exactly? Because to come to the same conclusions about money laundering and tax havens and so forth. So even if there aren't leaks, sometimes this information comes up in lawsuits. You would know. So offshore providers are secretive, but when there is wrongdoing, someone is going to notice that. There will be the financial intelligence unit that may issue penalties against these companies, and you sometimes find them in press releases. Or you may find them again in private laws, in civil or criminal lawsuits, when a plaintiff, a damaged person, or a government or whatever has a claim against somebody for fraud, for example, and that somebody has used the provider. So these are snippets of information that you can find also in without leaks, actually, they are very helpful to understand the whole picture, and also in public records. Sometimes, there may be an offshore company owning a property in your city, in your town, and so that's how you start pulling the thread.
Purity. There's a question. The thing we grapple with as journalists is how some of these exposés tend to fizzle out in countries where, press freedom is not very active, or there's weak rule of law. How do you make sure that it goes, and has impact?
So I think for journalists, we do stories and hope they they make impact. Sometimes they do, some other times they don't, but you keep at it. And one of the tips I think we've been discussing with my colleagues is the storytelling, the way you tell the story. Are you telling the story for just the few technocrats, or are you telling the story for public to understand? Sometimes it's for public to cause the impact. It's the job of the journalist is to report what it is. We are not activists. But yeah. I think we need to work more on storytelling, the way we tell the story. Does it matter to the person who matters and the person who cares?
Yeah. So we report it and then let the chips fall where they may. But
and sometimes maybe to add, sometimes also it's the quality of your investigations, because that's when sometimes law enforcement may ask to review your document and they may take up your reporting. So it's also to work really hard to have quality investigations and invest in training and doing stories that you don't look like you're going at someone, so that you're not biased, because when that happens, they will focus interest on you, and then to take away the public interest from the story you're telling. And to the person who asked the previous question about what do you do when you don't have a leak, I wanted to say about financial records that Miranda talked about and that you work on at Finance Uncovered a lot. We've done many stories without the leaks, but from financial records. Like in Kenya, we did a whole story about the Kenya Airways by just going through their financial records. So that's another place you look. You don't always wait for the leaks.
Miranda, there's a question about, some of our countries are half free in terms of press freedom, but there are others which are completely closed. Is that the case with Azerbaijan, for example? Does it make any difference that the exposé of Alia is done in the international press, but not in his own country?
I think it makes a difference because, so in one way, the Alia expose, for example, when U.S. Congress, wanted to pass, well, they basically announced that they want to work on the Enablers Act, right? They want to pass Enablers Act. And one of the stories that was, listed among the story that inspired them to do that was Azerbaijani story about the Alia family. So I think it shows that, there are people who are listening and paying attention even outside. When it comes to, story, can it be published locally in Azerbaijan? The situation is that you don't really have a local media which publish this kind of stories, but you do have a media which are working in exile who actually republished all these stories. Now, the problem with getting access to these stories in Azerbaijan is that you have to use VPN. All their websites are blocked. So much of the regular public does not even get these stories. And, in part also the people have been brainwashed over the years of manipulation of information that they don't even believe, even if you sell them, well, president did something wrong. But, as a journalist, it's important to tell these stories. And, we need to put them in the public domain because for once, this is a permanent trace. And, at some point, somebody will pay attention and it will get to the public in Azerbaijan. I also wanted to say something about, I agree that even when you don't have a leaks, there's so many stories you can tell. And, obviously financial records are one way. Other ways is there's so many business registries around the world that are open. Many people have never thought of going to BVI. They just went to UK. And, we have done amazing stories, but just by getting corporate information in UK, we once exposed that a son-in-law of the president in Tajikistan received basically a bribe in exchange for a mining license. And all of that was in the UK records. So basically you can get a lot of these stories, but you cannot get them in a scale like this, and you cannot expose the system as much without the leak. And that's where you need really these leaks.
Yeah, when we mention media here in this panel, we usually talking about the legacy media, you know, us dinosaurs. Is there a role for social media, because it does tend to or allow us to bypass official controls?
I think, you know, I'll give you one example, and I think there was one question before about, you know, should you be doing follow-up to make sure that you know, there's a reaction. You know, 2 years ago we did the big expose in Kyrgyzstan about 700 million that was basically looted out of countries through the customs fraud. And, you know, when we initially published the story, people went on streets, but nothing happened in terms of, you know, reactions from the authorities. And that was just the beginning for us, because we've uncovered that one of the person who was responsible was the very powerful customs boss, who also was, you know, very politically connected, obviously had a lot of illegal money and so on. So we kept looking into him, and we ended up publishing a number of other stories, which ultimately resulted, you know, in part in revolution, in part in like, you know, law enforcement finally taking action, you know, even arresting the person. And I think, you know, as a journalist, you know, if you have a story, and I don't mean this as like vigilante, you know, you're trying to get somebody arrested, but if the person has done, you know, a lot, even if, you know, a lot of in terms of wrongdoing, and there are many stories for you to report, you can report, and you should report them over time, because ultimately, you know, somebody, you know, even in the most difficult part of the world, you know, can hear and see what, you know, the story you have published, and see the wrongdoing and take action.
Yeah.
So,
Purity, you know, there have been reprisals against journalists who have written or, you know, published Pandora Papers exposés in their countries. Honduras is one, Russia and other countries. Is there an element of self-censorship when it comes to these things? I mean, do journalists have to take their you know their limits before they take these risks?
I wouldn't call it self-censorship in our case. I wouldn't call it vigilance in professionalism, because I think like when we were working on story about Kenyatta family, we knew exactly who we are working a story about, and instead of pulling back, what we made sure we did is concentrate on this specific story, but do it very properly, without any errors, without any, like with all the legal measures, and like being more vigilant in the quality of work that you do in our case. But I think sometimes some people really have sometimes maybe not publish the story, or have the story published elsewhere and then they republish. Of course, there is looking at your life matters. If you're not alive, you won't do another story. So you have to measure, yeah, but not self-censor. I would say it's being vigilant in doing quality work.
Yeah, definitely. I think that you know, we all have to gauge what the risks are, and there's no point in getting killed over a story, because then you can't write it. There seems to be a question for, I think it'll be for Scilla, because it's about how much cooperation are we getting from international organizations like the FATF, UN, Interpol, Europol, and the EU Public Prosecutor's Office. Are they showing some interest in some of the evidence that you've gathered or not?
Yes. I mean, a lot of countries after Pandora Papers were published came forward saying that they were going to investigate the people in Pandora Papers, like many countries, and others. Some agencies have also reached out to ICIJ, but ICIJ is it's a news organization. We do not collaborate with the government agencies, and also because they have much more power and more resources to go after these people. They don't need a bunch of journalists to do that for them. But the only way we can do that is to be transparent, and that's why we have the offshore leaks database. That's for anybody. Could be a government agency, could be a person going, like a plaintiff or a defendant. I think transparency for us is what it's our tool in this case to show that these things matter, and if you want to take them on, then you can do it.
Maybe there's a follow-up to that. Is there a legal implication for publishing all this data in open data, in open data?
Yeah, there is. So that's why we don't do what, for example, WikiLeaks did in the past, which is just releasing the whole bunch of documents. We only release names of companies, and our data team painstakingly go through all of them, because we have to make sure that these are correct. We have seen I've seen also by doing research sometimes that there are wrong date of birth, or some providers identify the wrong person. So the reason why we don't just release the whole thing is that because there are many mistakes, and also personal information, bank information that are not necessarily for the public interest, and that's what our priority when we do this project. We also go, and all our partners request comment to the people that they talk about in their stories, and obviously we could not do that about people in 12 million records.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've come to the end of questions, unless I missed out on some of them. But thank you very much, panelists, for a really, really vigorous discussion, and also raising some really important points. I don't know if you noticed, but I was taking notes furiously here because there was just so many tips for me as a journalist as well. But before I say bye to you and close the session, I'd like to thank, besides the panelists, I'd also like to thank the interpreters who've done amazing work, also translating some of these questions, as well as the organizers, and of course, the 400 or so attendees who are listening to us from all over the world. So good night, wherever you are, or good morning, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.